Chapter 2 is probably the single most important chapter in your textbook because really this is at the heart of any form of writing. Writing is communication. There are very few forms of writing that you can say are completely private. And the reason is, even when you're writing a poem that's really intensely personal, it's for yourself, or writing in your diary, or writing in your journal, there's a need to get those thoughts out of your head and onto paper. And oftentimes, if you were writing a poem uh, about unrequited love, and you're writing it kind of for you, the object of your affection, without intending ever to send it, you are still imagining yourself communicating to that person. Oftentimes you write a journal as if you were addressing yourself, or God, or your future self, or your past self, or the journal itself as a friend. But again, a lot of what you're doing, even when it's private, you have in mind some sort of vague audience. In the workplace, of course, you don't have vague audiences, you have very specific audiences. Your first document is very much about audience analysis. When you're writing a cover letter or a resume, you not only need to know about the ad that you found online or in the paper, but as much as you can find out or guess about who's going to be processing your resume at the other end, what kind of company you're applying for, what kind of expectations are of this job in the workplace. So your audience is absolutely an essential part. Understanding your audience is absolutely essential, key part of any sort of communication, but especially in the workplace. So let's hit a few highlights here. Um, Before you write anything, you need to identify very precisely who's going to be reading your document, what you can find out about them, and then how they're going to use that material. What's your purpose in writing? What will their purpose be in accessing that material? This graphic says it very nicely. How will I give readers what they need? To know that, you have to understand your readers. You have to understand what they're going to do with the information you're giving them, or the material you're providing for them. And then you can kind of make the connection between those two things. You're going to be completing an audience and purpose analysis for every document you write in here, and the page number for that is included in the course. It's in your text, and it's in this chapter, which you've read or will read very carefully, and you absolutely need to do that. Okay, but some of the questions that your audience and purpose analysis are going to ask is, first of all, who is the main audience for this document? Aside from that, who else is likely to read it? So you might be writing a document, an email, or a memo to your coworkers on a team. That's your primary audience. You'll be accomplishing something specific for them. But who else might read that? Your supervisor might read that. Your other colleagues outside of your team might have access to it at some point. In the workplace, you're always thinking about the possibility that the IRS, right, or other legal entities might someday be using your communication if something goes wrong down the road. Okay, so you have potentially a very broad audience. Your primary audience is where your focus is going to be, but you do keep those other audiences in mind as you are writing. Your relationship with the audience is absolutely important, and sometimes you'll have multiple relationships. For example, on a team, you might have professional relationships. You might have personal relationships. You might have some people on the team with whom you have kind of a bad relationship, and others with whom you have very good relationships. With the secondary audience, you might have a completely different relationship than you have with the people in your team. One of the most important relationships you want to be aware of is the power relationship. In other words, are you writing to equals? Are you writing to people over whom you have some authority? Or are you writing to somebody who has authority over you? And that will affect how you craft your document. What information does your audience need? And then how familiar might they be with the technical aspects of what you're writing about? And we'll look at a very nice graphic in just a bit that gets at determining that, and considerations to take into consideration as you do that. You would take considerations into consideration because they're considerations. Do the readers have potentially varying levels of expertise? In other words, are some people on your team specialized in the same thing you are and others not? Do you have a couple of other engineers on the team, but you also have an accountant or a marketing person, in which case you might have to deal with that in your document somehow? Your text suggests some very nice ways of doing that. Could there be cultural issues involved? And that's something to be aware of to a degree. Be conscious of the fact that there are cultural sensitivities that you need to be you need to look into and think about as you craft your document. They may not always have a tremendous impact on the document, but let's say you're writing an email to colleagues overseas and you know about the culture that they don't like a lot of kind of directness in communications. When I lived in Saudi Arabia for another number of years, one thing I discovered when I go in to talk to my bosses, they hated it when you just sat down and got right to the point. They wanted a little bit of personal communication first. They wanted you to sit, ask how things are going, chit chat a little bit, and then get to the point. It was considered really rude just to jump into it and get to the point right away. It's like they're using them or something like that. And so in an email or in face-to-face communication with them, I'd have to be conscious of warming up to my subject a little bit. Otherwise, I might offend them, writing something that would be perfectly fine in our cultural setting here. Your primary audience is the immediate audience you're going to be writing to. So for example, your workplace communication, your primary audience is going to be whoever is going to be giving you that job. Does that make sense? So if you have somebody who is a supervisor in a department, you know they're the decision maker, that's who you're going to have in mind as you write this. Secondary audiences will be other people who will access and look at your information. And this is a balancing act here, because the other people who will see your resume and cover letter will be human resources people in most places. And the level of technical expertise and the relative importance of both of those audiences will vary a little bit depending on who you're applying to. You need to make sure your resume and cover letter will get past the HR person, so be clear enough and use the language of the ad enough that they can see, yes, this person is qualified, they should go forward, but also be technical enough to reveal your expertise, support your expertise, persuade the decision maker of your expertise. Your relationship to readers is extremely important, and I mentioned this before. Are the people you're writing to your superiors, colleagues, or subordinates? Workplace communication, that's tricky. Because it could be all three of them. Yes, they're going to hire you, so in that sense you have to treat them like your superiors, but you will oftentimes be also writing to the people with whom you're going to be working, and a lot of what they're assessing is not just your technical ability, but whether or not they can see themselves working with you day in and day out. Don't diminish how important that is. They're not only choosing an employee, they're choosing a colleague. They're choosing the person who's going to be sitting next to them at work day in and day out. Are they inside or outside of your organization? A memo versus a letter, for example. This is essential. People inside the organization will have information and expertise and knowledge that people outside the organization won't. There'll be ways you'll have to treat people outside the organization that maybe you can get away with not treating people inside the organization, depending on the level of formality established. Do you know people personally? Is there a personal relationship there? And how do you expect them to respond to your information? Are they going to be happy about what you're telling them or asking of them, or is there going to be some resistance there? Before you write, be very clear what you're attempting to accomplish with that document. Okay? Primary purpose, other purposes, and what readers are going to do with the information. Primary purpose is going to be what that document's aimed at doing, but as I said before, there are other purposes, that implicit purpose that you want to convince people of your professionalism, shore up a relationship, rebuild a relationship. You may be providing information on a project you've been asked to work on by your superior. So yes, you want to provide that information. That's your main purpose, but you also want to do so in a way that impresses that superior. So there can be multiple purposes, and there almost always are. Primary purpose, the main purpose, we'd mentioned these earlier: inform, to instruct, or persuade. These are the three primary purposes for writing in the workplace, technical communication. Secondary purposes, what else that document may have to do. Okay. How do you expect people to use a document? And again, this will get down to the kind of document you write as well. So are they learning facts, understanding things? Are they going to use this for decision making? Are they going to act immediately on it? So is there an urgency about it? Do they need step-by-step walking through of whatever you're talking to them about? And from their perspective, what's most important? What's the thing they're going to look at immediately? And these are only some examples of concerns, and oftentimes a document will have to accomplish more than one of these. Here's that graphic I mentioned about level of technical ability. Now look at the list on the column on the far left. Who will use this document? Experts, informed persons who have some level of expertise, about a subject, and then complete laypersons. If you're in the workplace, for example, and you are working at Dow Chemical, and you're on a team that includes engineers, marketing people, and some financial people, you will have experts, your fellow engineers on that team. Chances are the marketing people and the finance people, if they work for Dow, they would probably be informed. They would probably have some basic understanding of what the technical aspects of what Dow does are. They may not know all of the science, but they have a general idea. Whereas if you're writing to the broader community, you're writing to people who are completely non-technical. On the far right, some indicators of how much information each group will need. Now, one thing you'll notice, the less technical the audience is, usually the longer that document has to be, or the more information will be needed in that document. So experts, you can just give them the facts and figures. They'll know how to digest it and put it together. You may still make comments on your interpretation of those, but you don't have to provide explanations or justifications in a way that you do with a non-technical or semi-technical audience. Semi-technical audiences, you may need to explain some of the jargon, or even less than the jargon, the facts, figures, some of the specific data that you've included. They may have a general idea of a concept, but they may not have been trained in reading data related to that concept. Non-technical audiences, you're probably not going to present them with a lot of direct data. If you do, you're going to be explaining it in very detailed terms, but very simple language. More often than not, you will provide the explanation without all of the data. In other words, you wouldn't have a 3-page table or chart or graph. You would have a paragraph that explains the core findings of that. You may use the graph as support for that, but the main conveyor of information would be the graphic there. Again, be conscious of audience's cultural background. We've talked about this earlier. Level of formality, level of directness especially, are very key in intercultural communication. And don't assume everyone's of the same culture. If you're working any place in the Tri-City area, if you're working at Dow Chemical, which is where a lot of you may wind up working someday, or in a hospital, a local hospital, you're going to have multiple cultures represented in your work group, because there's so many international employees, and we do have multiple cultures within America as well. And you have to be conscious of that. A rural versus a big city culture, that makes a difference, right? People who grew up in very large urban cities tend to see things a little bit differently than people who grew up in small towns or on farms. Not in fundamental ways, but possibly in ways that are significant enough for you to be aware of as you try to communicate. Be aware of your audience's preferences. How much information are they willing to take, and how much do they need? How long does this document have to be? What's the most appropriate format? A lot of that will be defined in your workplace by your employer. So for one type of document, you might have to do a safety report once a week on your work area. That will be a specific type of document that they'll have assigned. You may have to communicate in certain things in emails and letters or whatnot. And then the appropriate tone. And the best way to get a sense for this is to read what other people are writing in the workplace around you as best you can. If you are applying for a job, try to suss out the language of the workplace by looking at their website, for example, and just get a feel for what kind of work environment that tends to be. Of course, a workplace correspondence will always be polite and relatively formal, no matter what. You always, it's like they say, you show up for the interview dressed for the job you want to have, not the job you have. In other words, you go in with that suit, that tie, looking professional, even if that's not going to be part of what you'll be wearing day to day at work. It shows respect for the person interviewing you and for the place at which you're interviewing. Due date and timing, budget, these are all considerations that can come in the workplace. One thing to be really aware of in classes as well as in the workplace, if there's a deadline, plan out milestones for yourself. You do not want to be writing your technical report for this class 2 days before it's due, because it's a very complicated document. Finally, you'll be developing an audience and use profile. This is actually outlined in your text. There's a 1-page overview, it might be a page and a half overview of exactly the questions you ask. You'll be developing one of these for your week 2 discussion forum, analyzing the company to which you're applying for your job, and for each of our subsequent documents. So read that carefully and read the details on that carefully in your text.